Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this session of the Audit Committee. I am joined by Council President Evan Glass, Council Vice President Andrew Friedson, and Council Member Sydney Katz. Thank you today to Ms. Lamarzi and everyone for joining us. We're going to be reviewing two recent reports that you have sent to the Council. The Inspector General Report 23-10, Performance Audit of Solid Waste Activities, and the Inspector General Report 23-15, the Carryout Bag Tax. Aside from these two reports, I want to take a moment to acknowledge that the IG has sent over 4 reports since our last meeting, including the September 14th memo sent to Council related to misconduct by a County Council Central staff employee. While we will not delve into this issue today because investigations are ongoing and the personnel matters are still being managed, I want to personally note the importance of this investigation because of the work of this committee is to monitor what is happening in county government. And we do not shy away from situations related to this department when appropriate. I want to note, according to the memo that we've received, as soon as our council executive director was made aware of the situation, she was in contact with the IG. I will ask the IG if she wants to make any comment on this issue, and if not, we can move forward to our first agenda. Ms. Lamarzi would...
No, thank you, ma'am.
All right, thank you, and thank you for your work in that matter. Before I turn it back to Ms. Lamarzi, any other comments from the Audit Committee? Okay. Seeing none, Ms. Lamarzi, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning. Very nice to see all of you. We have been very busy in the Office of the Inspector General since last we were before you in June. As the chair stated, we have published 4 reports since June. We have also issued our FY23 annual report. We have 5 open announced engagements currently, audits of the Department of Transportation and Police, 2 engagements at Montgomery County Public Schools, a review of the handling of complaints of allegations of misconduct by school employees, and specific investigation into allegations of misconduct by Joel Beitelman. And a 5th engagement has been announced, which is a review of the county short-term rental program. Those have all been announced or are ongoing. Our hotline activity is up 94% from where it was at this time last year. So we are actively engaged with residents and members of our community and county government to answer their concerns, to hear information, and to incorporate that into all the work that we do. Our revised work plan will be issued later this fall, and we also are really spending a great deal of time supporting and cultivating our professional staff with opportunities for training, professional development, and collaboration moments. So we have been incredibly busy, but I'm very happy to come forward today and speak with you about 2 different reports that have been sent and published. The first of which is, as was referred to by Ms. Stewart, was the performance audit of the solid waste activities at the Department of Environmental Protection, which was released in February of this year. Pursuant to our audit mandate, which you are all very familiar with now, we must go to every principal department and county government on a rotating basis to perform a review of their control procedures, financial systems, and also look at high-risk contracts and agreements. When we go and we begin these audits, we spend a great deal of time researching, doing background, talking with stakeholders, and doing a risk assessment for us to identify where in the department we're going to focus our resources. DEP, for example, in FY22 had an operating budget of $168 million. They have numerous programs and obligations. We obviously cannot spend all of our time there or we wouldn't get to anyone else. So we really have to work through a very concise process to figure out where to go and where to focus our activities. 80% of DEP's overall budget is in their recycling and resource management areas. And in that are 2 enterprise funds, which together in FY22 had a combined value of approximately $135 million. Big money doesn't always equal risk, but it is a factor that we have to consider. Drilling down further in that area, DEP budgeted about $36 million in FY22 to the collection contractors, which are, as a lot of people probably know, but for those who don't, in Montgomery County, some residents, your trash is collected by the county. Some residents, your trash is collected by a private company. So a lot of those folks are people that live in an area with a homeowners association, for example, your HOA contracts with a private company to pick up your trash. For the rest of the county that aren't in those zones, county does contract with haulers and has service areas throughout the county who come and pick up the trash. And so that is the area that we then focused in even further as we began the audit. We had 4 objectives in this audit. We were primarily looking at activities between July 1st of 2021 and June 30th of 2022. Our first objective was to, in looking at these contracts again for the haulers, the trash collecting with the county, was to look at how the inclusion of labor peace agreements have affected the county's ability to foster competition in these residential collection service contracts. So under county law that was enacted in 2019, the county can consider if it's in the best interest of the county to require in a request for proposal that companies that are awarded contracts with the county have labor peace agreements. So they have unions within their companies. So when we began the audit, we really wanted to look and see, okay, this law has been in effect since 19. It does affect DEP. What have the effects, the consequences, what impact has that had, specifically also thinking about the costs that are incurred through this. But as we began to do the work, we encountered a number of challenges with performing that analysis. The biggest of which is really there was not enough data. Only one other contract had already gone through that had an LPA associated with it. There were 2 service areas that were out for bid, and for a number of different reasons, they were out for bid, they weren't. They were out again, and those just didn't come to fruition, and we didn't have the final data in the time and scope of the audit for us to really do that analysis. So that's an area for us to return to in the future. And so that was one of our objectives, but we weren't able to do that analysis or have findings in that area. Our other 3 objectives, though, were to analyze the effect of information and assumptions that are used to administer the refuse collection fund, to determine the extent to which DEP monitors residential collection service contract terms. So how are they handling price increases? Are they following performance bond requirements? How do they handle service inquiries, issues, complaints? Nobody picked up my stuff today. They threw my trash cans over there. How are they handling that? And lastly, to evaluate the controls and processing for the approval of the licenses for the haulers and collectors. Again, I told you about the private side. So those companies that are picking up the trash have to be registered with the county. They have to conform to certain requirements. They get a decal on their truck and such. And so how is that process being managed? That has a cost to it as well. Those were the objectives of the audit. The results were, we had 6 different findings. The first 3 are really centered in the residential collection contract monitoring area. The first was regarding the consumer price index percentage that was applied to rate increases for these contracts differed from the terms of service contracts. So each year, these service providers are eligible for a price increase. And the amendments and those changes, the calculation that was used, the consumer price index that was used varied. And that led to higher than expected payments going out, and it did lead to disparities. There are a number of CPIs in the region, let alone in the country. You could use a CPI for the DC metropolitan area. You could use them for the Baltimore metropolitan area. You could use them for cities across the country. Obviously, cities across the country are very different than what we have here. So by applying a different CPI, that rate increase is very different, and it's not conforming with what was written in the contracts either. The second finding was that solid waste performance bonds did not include all the requirements that the county has for our bonds. Performance bonds are required of contractors who do business with the county so that if they don't meet their requirements, we have some way of resolving those issues. Procurement regulations give a minimum of what has to be included in a performance bond when you do business with the county. You have to say that Montgomery County is the obligee. You have to say that the state of Maryland is where we're going to litigate these issues. And we found in our testing that it wasn't the case that all of the performance bonds had all of the information that they should have under county regulations. that could lead to challenges with enforcement later. It's a protection issue for the county. Our third finding was due to an operating deficit within the solid waste collection fund. The county was due to the county not following and DEP not following their fund balance policy. So the idea is that these funds are to maintain under DEP policy 10 to 15% of the assets, so that if there's a problem in service area 5 and that contractor no longer is going to collect the trash, they've gone on strike, which has happened in this county before, right? Or they have gone under for some reason, we have to still make sure people's trash gets picked up. So we have this fund to make sure the county it's like a rainy day fund. It has this balance and it's available. But that fund was operating in a deficit. Though the refuse collection charge was slowly increasing in the county, the calculations used to figure that charge out, the formulas, were not getting the county to the place where they had the right projection and we had a fund that was healthy. And in fact, we had a number of conversations during the audit with folks at DEP about needing to probably go even further looking at the fund and determining if 10 to 15% is even enough these days, because the costs really have gone up a great deal for a lot of these contracts. The next three group of findings you see are related to the hauler and the collector licensing process that goes on over at the transfer station. The first finding is that the licensing system, the computer system itself, had user access that was not reviewed as required by county policy. We want to make sure that everyone has the appropriate level of access throughout the county government to our systems. So not everyone needs to be able to change every data field. Not everyone needs anything more than maybe all you need is read only. Maybe you had a job where you needed that and then you moved to a different department. You don't need it anymore. So the county has a procedure, 6-7, that requires an annual review of access controls, and that wasn't being done. So there were a number of people who had great deal of access and ability to make changes within the system. And that needs to be reviewed and they need to follow with that. The next finding was that the licensing process lacked a separation of duties. You've heard before, both Mr. Brogley and I have talked about the importance of controls and separation of duties. You need a checks and balances when you're collecting money. You're issuing a permit. You're inputting the data. You're deciding if it has an expiration date, that sort of thing. You want to make sure you have different people. DEP at the time had one person handling every part of the process. That exposes the county to trouble. And our last finding was that DEP did not properly safeguard the decals and related records. So if you walk in the office, anybody really could walk away with a decal, and they do have a value. That is a part of the process. So DEP wasn't keeping those secured in a location. They also weren't keeping a running tracking list of, I gave this individual permit 2 and this individual permit 4. Wait a minute, what happened to 3? Those are very important concepts. And those were the findings that we had. Those findings led to 12 total recommendations that are aimed at improving the effectiveness and the efficiency of the solid waste activities and ensuring that there is adherence to county law and regulation. Those included things like DEP needs to ensure that the consumer price index terms are updated and performance bond requirements are met within the service contracts. DEP needs to ensure that refuse collection fund is compliant with county code and has a sufficient reserve balance. We recommended that DEP implement separation of duties throughout the collector hauler licensing process. And lastly, that they implement written procedures to ensure compliance with the AP, which requires that privilege control within the system, and safeguarding the permit decals along the way. I really would like to thank the audit team that worked on this for a great deal of time. Lindsay Miller, Charles DK, Jessica Miller, Nelson, and Nana Badu, and also thank Ms. Wan and Mr. Weiner, who were really instrumental in making sure that we were able to get through this audit. They were very open and discussed a lot of topics, and I think there was a great deal of back and forth between our auditors, and it's a great example of how we really do work together. And the goal of these audits is to find ways to make improvements, and they were partners in wanting to find ways to make improvements as well.
Great. Well, thank you very much for that report, Ms. Lamarzi. And again, I think as we've stressed before, when you've come before us, this is really about a partnership and the role of your office to go through systematically all of our departments, and particularly when it's such a large department like DEP and the operations that you were looking at are such a large part of those departments' budgets. I'm going to turn it over now, before I turn it over to my colleagues, to ask if DEP has anything they'd like to say. And Director Munger, we are all very conscious of the fact that you have just taken on the role of director, and that this report, the information precedes you from taking on, and that we received this report in February, even before you took over as director. But we're glad to see you are here and look forward to talking to you and your colleagues.
Thanks, Chair Stewart and Councilmember Friedson, Councilmember Katz, Councilmember Glass. Appreciate the opportunity to be with you this morning to talk about the progress the Department of Environmental Protection has been making in addressing the findings and recommendations from these two audits conducted by the Office of the Inspector General. And this was actually this morning was the first chance I had to meet Ms. Lamarzi in person, and I just want to say a very public thank you to you and your team for the importance of your work. Coming from the federal government, both working in Congress and in the executive branch, I really came to appreciate the value of the Inspector General and having an independent lens focused on our operations and working on identifying solutions, as you said, Chair Stewart, and enhancing compliance with our policies moving forward. So I'm looking forward to working with the Office of Inspector General going forward as well. With respect to the report you were just briefed on, the performance audit of solid waste activities, substantial progress has been made in addressing the 12 recommendations contained in the report from February of this year. And I just want to walk through some of the progress we've made this morning to share it with the committee. Many of the actions were implemented before I became director, as you said, so I can take very little credit for the progress, but I'm nonetheless pleased to report that corrective actions have been implemented to address 8 of the recommendations. And because of the nature of the corrective actions required to address the remaining 4, we're on a path to addressing those recommendations, but final actions haven't yet been completed. And I'll elaborate further on those in a moment here. To be specific, with request to recommendation number 1, which was the recommendation was that DEP ensure exclusive residential collection service contract consumer price index terms are updated to reflect the actual criteria used, as the Inspector General said. As I'm sure you're all aware, the county has divided its collections operations into 13 service areas, each of which has a separate contract. And in the case of 5 service areas, the collections contracts has already had current CPI terms as part of those contracts. The department's gone back and reviewed the contracts for all 13 service areas and identified the contracts for service areas 1 through 8 as requiring amendments to reflect CPI language that's consistent with the index the county is actually using. For areas 6 and 8, we expect new contracts will be awarded in the next month, and we've updated the CPI language as part of those solicitations. And I've directed that technical amendments to address the CPI language in the remaining 6 contracts be sent to the contractors by December. With respect to recommendation number 2, which was a recommendation that DEP ensure that all performance bond requirements are met, as the Inspector General was describing, and included in the bond prior to the execution of exclusive residential collection service contracts. As part of the review of the contracts I referenced with respect to recommendation number 1, the department determined that for service areas 9 through 13, the contracts already met the 50% performance bond requirements. A performance bond set at 50% of the annual contract value, for your awareness, ultimately provides coverage for 6 months of service in the event of performance failure by the contractor. For areas 6 and 8, we're addressing the bond requirements as part of the new contract awards I mentioned previously. And for the remaining 6 service areas, the department will ensure that the 50% bond requirements are met as those contracts come up for recompetition over the next 3 years. And the reason for that is because those bond premiums are calculated in the unit price for services, we can't modify the requirements until those contracts themselves are actually rebid. The remaining 2 recommendations concern the refuse collection fund balance in compliance with the county's fund balance policy, as the Inspector General stated. Recommendation 3A, as the IG noted, was that they recommend DEP ensure the refuse collection fund is compliant with the section of the county code by not operating in a deficit. Consideration should be given to increasing refuse collection charges, the use of a consistent standard for contractor requested price adjustment, and implementation of practices to reduce fund expenditures. The county's FY24 approved budget and refuse collection charges reflects a 2-year plan that will ensure the refuse collection fund is compliant with the 10% minimum fund balances by FY25, which will address recommendation 3A, and will continue to ensure that the refuse collection fund remains compliant with code requirements and fund balance policy requirements going forward. Recommendation 3B was that the IG recommended the DEP ensure that the refuse collection fund reserve balance is sufficient to cover the cost to replace lost service of its largest contractor for 6 months to allow for continuity of service. This concerns a provision that requires the county to maintain that reserve balance with the intent of guarding against interruption in service, as I think you all know, should one of the contract haulers fail. And while the FY24 approved budget and refuse collection charges will allow us to meet the 10% fund balance policies requirement by FY25, we do not expect it will allow us to meet that 6-month test. There are many ongoing conversations in the county about how to address that recommendation. It's as you can imagine, a significant issue that needs attention, and those conversations are still ongoing. We're happy to provide more information as those proceed. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much for that update. We appreciate that, and we understand there are many things in the works, and I'm sure as our Council Vice President and the Chair of T&E, there are some things that we'll want to get into in T&E as we look at some of these issues. First, I'll turn to my colleagues to see if anyone has any questions. Councilmember Katz.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the report, and thank you for all who are working on this. Can you explain to me where the money comes from for the collection fund? Where is that money coming from?
Thanks for the question, Council Member. I'm going to turn to Willie Wayner, who oversees the relevant division, to answer your question.
Good morning.
Good morning.
So we have two different funds, the disposal fund, the collections fund. The collections fund is, as you know, the system benefit charge, which is the one that contains the two funds. It's a service, a fee-for-service type of system. So basically, the services that we provide in collections, for the most part, recycling collections and refuse collections, they are being serviced by these two funds. So the collections fund is the one that, where the money is coming from, of course, from the system benefit charge. Is one of the two funds. The collection.
So once you collect it, let me interrupt for 2 seconds. Once you collect it, that money is put in a fund, and then you pay the hauler?
Yes.
How does that work?
Yes, it's a fee-for-service fund. So that's the money that will allow us to pay that portion of the service to the collectors.
So the hauler is getting 10 to 15% less for doing the job so that you can hold the money?
No.
Well, how does that work then?
No, the collection fund includes the monies that we need to pay to the contractors for doing their work.
Yeah.
And also, when we're collecting that money, we are securing 10% at this point to put into the fund, just for a rainy day.
Is the person who is paying for the hauler? I mean, I live in a municipality that does not, we have private haulers, so I'm not familiar exactly how it works. But if the person who is paying for the trash pickup that the county is providing, are they paying 10 to 15% more so that they can put those, so that you have the additional funds? I don't understand how the numbers work.
Yeah, the collection fund and the disposal fund are designed so we can not only pay the contractors for the work they're doing, but also to collect the funds that we need in the rainy day fund, call it, to support that 10% that we were talking about.
All right, and when we were talking, and you said there was 13, I believe, 13 different service areas.
Yes.
Though that's for the actual refuse pickup. Does everyone in the county under the recycling fee?
Yes.
So is that a separate?
No,
No?
the refuse fund is what pays for the trash collection.
Yes.
So areas 1 through 6 are having all the services: trash, recycling, scrap metal, yard waste. Areas 7 through 13 have only recycling service. They don't have refuse service unless there are certain pockets in those areas that have opted for having county service for trash. So there are certain homes that will be charged the full rate. The other homes in area 7 to 13 that don't receive refuse collection, they are not being charged for that.
But they are being charged for recycling.
Of course.
And is there a collection fund for that as well? Do you have the 10 to 15% collection fund for the recycling?
Yes.
You do. Okay, I think that answers. I am concerned about the 10 to 15%, where that money is coming from, and how that. I mean, we want to make certain that the haulers, who are private haulers, it's not county employees that are hauling, that we want to make certain that they have enough funds to stay in business. And so 10 to 15% can be a substantial number. That's my concern. So thank you.
Okay. Council President Glass?
Thank you, Chair Stewart. I appreciate this conversation, which is noteworthy because it's, as far as I'm aware, the first time this audit committee is being utilized in this way to dive deeper into an area that, quite frankly, has policy implications within the council and overlaps within Transportation and Environment Committee and others. And so I appreciate this, and the chair and I have talked about how to structure this in some way, because clearly there are parts of this conversation that will require further discussion, most likely in the Transportation and Environment Committee, but it's noteworthy that you have 2 of the 3 members who are here as well, so we're already briefed. And with regard to the different areas, we have not yet talked about this in this council, the existential question about whether there should be 2 sub-districts with regard to our waste management. There is a report last year, or last council session, we had a very robust committee work session, and we haven't really picked it up since then. Quite possibly this might give us an impetus to do that, recognizing that the system needs some recalibrating, and that might be the reason to have that conversation. I can talk with staff and talk with colleagues about picking it up at the T&E committee. But I think that might be a bigger question, worthy of conversation. Councilmember Katz asked about that delta that I wanted to ask about, so I appreciate that question. I don't have any other questions right now, but again, I think this forces us to have that bigger conversation about all the 2 sub-districts and all the districts within. And let me ask maybe a different question related to the 15%. Has any of this resulted in any service problems, any change of service or any disruption of service for any of our residents?
Thanks for the question, Councilmember. Just to clarify, when you say has any of this resulted in service disruptions, which What are you referring to with the this?
Well, today is, in my district, it's trash day, or in my particular neighborhood. And so as we're talking about the mechanics of the funding, right, and making sure that between CPI and the fund balances, has that resulted in any community not getting trash or recycling pickup? Which ultimately is what we want to ensure, right? This is all to make sure that our processes are working properly and that people, their services are being delivered.
Thanks for the clarification. That's absolutely right. I'll let Willie elaborate, but I can say that for the over 200,000 homes in the county for which collection services occur, our complaint rates are remarkably low in terms of the phone calls into 311 about concerns, and that's something we're really proud of, and we're working really hard to keep it that way. I'll let Willie elaborate on the disruption piece.
Thank you, John. No, these funds are not having an effect on the haulers at all. I mean, these are what we are collecting is something that we see internally, but it doesn't transfer to the collection companies. So we keep providing the same excellent service that we've been providing for the last many years.
It's good to say that out loud for people who are following the conversation and trying to connect the dots between how the funds are collected, what they're done, what are done with those funds, and ultimately what most people see, which is the collection of their trash and recycling. So thank you for that clarification. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Council Vice President?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think this is the second time we've done this. I appreciate it. I think it's a good model for us to really dig into these issues. I'll reinforce what I said before about how important this is, the idea of doing the regular reviews of each county department and not just a reactive approach, which had been the precedent, but a much more proactive approach from the Office of the Inspector General was the whole idea, was the whole goal. I was proud to work very hard on making that a reality, and working with the previous Government Operations Fiscal Policy Committee, and glad that we are really embracing it and continuing it with this one. So great work in that. I think the good news here is we identified problems. There was a collaborative dynamic, it seems, between the department and the Inspector General, which is how it should work. And there was largely concurrence from the executive branch to fix the problems, which were identified. That's the way the process is supposed to work, and I think that is a real positive, and at a high level, that's the takeaway. I am wondering, though, besides treating some of the the symptoms of the problem, do we have a sense of more macro level issues in the department that may have led to some of these errors occurring? Maybe first we could turn to the Inspector General if there was any assessment of that, and then perhaps to our very new director, who I am not holding personally responsible for any of these macro level issues, but you may not have caused the problem, but you have inherited it, and you're now responsible for it. So I ask that in a general way to say we always should be driving to do better. I just want to make sure that when we have reports like this, which, this is not corruption or malfeasance or theft. These are things got a little loose and things were missed, and, errors were made and compounded, on errors. And the question is, how do we create systems where, the holes aren't that big to let things slip through those cracks? I don't know if, perhaps Ms. Lamarza, you have, thoughts on that on a more macro level, not necessarily the specific findings and recommendations on things that you found or takeaways that you might have from this report.
Sure. I think some of it is what we are used to seeing in running large government. If you look at the second half of findings recommendations dealing with the process for the hauler licenses and the decals and the access to the systems, that's kind of bread and butter stuff of government, just buttoning things up that get lost a lot because folks say, well, it's working fine, so no harm, no foul. But if you don't have those systems in place to back it up, it's not always going to work just fine. And I think it just gets lost. And the other three findings, I think, are attributable sort of to where everyone is moving forward, working. You don't always take a step back and say, okay, what were the effects of us just kind of plowing along with how we've always done it? And I think these are some opportunities for everyone to slow down, especially with contracts and the contracting language, and to really, I think everybody in county government starts with, oh, this was our contract last time, we're just gonna start with this. Got to read that and see, is that really right? Are there changes? Have there been new policy changes, new legislation, new programs put into place that then make changes and affect that? And it's just a challenge when you're running such large organizations, is making the time and managers having the time to be able to really think about those things and address them.
Any thoughts from the director or the department?
Thanks for the question, council member. So I agree with the types of issues the Inspector General is saying in terms of making sure that these operations are designed to function in a way that's going to make sure that we're providing exceptional services to the people who live in this county and work in this county, both now and in the future. And so I don't have a specific reaction, but I want to echo that. I think that looking at these types of issues in a really thoughtful manner, in a way that's focused on constantly improving our operations, is a really good idea, because I think the people who we serve rightfully have come to expect and deserve the type of exceptional service that we're really proud of providing on a regular basis. So I want to support these types of conversations because I think that they're really fundamental to making sure we continue to provide that level of service.
Is there a person in the department who is specifically responsible for overseeing these issues, the various issues? Like to make sure that processes are being followed, to make sure that policies are being adhered to? Is that someone within the department? Is the expectation that someone outside the department?
Was that directed to me, council member?
Sure.
Well,
directed at either. But I mean, I guess the question is like, what expect? Like at a certain point, who is checking to make sure that this is happening? So the first part of the question is on an ongoing basis, whose job is it in each of these areas or in all of them to make sure that processes are being followed? Whose desk is that crossing to sign off and bless that the process is working appropriately? Number one. Number two would be some of these we're told are being worked on now or have been improved. Like, for instance, the database was, according to the CAO, it was being worked on but hadn't been implemented at the time of the completion of the report, but the response is it's since been handled. Several of these are concur, we're going to do that moving forward. But who is going to be following up to make sure that the concurrence in writing becomes concurrence in practice?
I love that you asked that question. Follow-up is an important part of the audit process. We are required by standards, by county law, to follow government auditing standards. That includes a follow-up process. And it is something that is evolving in my own office. I will admit it is something we need to improve on, and we have just created a new system for us to do follow-up, where we will be requiring that our auditees spend time with us on the front end before we even publish, talking about their corrective actions. So we can say if we think that's addressing what our issues were, and then doing follow-up every 90 days with them to see what the final results are. Internal audit gets reports right now, but we didn't always get those. They're supplied to me when I ask for them, of course, but we need to have a lot of follow-up questions. Even in the most recent update we got in July from DEP on their progress, we have follow-up questions that we've posed to them that we need those answers still. And then, of course, we'll do follow-up audits. Sometimes we do independent follow-up audits of going back to see if corrective actions actually fix the problems, or because under the mandate we are cyclical, we will go back to DEP, hopefully in 4 to 5 years, and we will look at the implementation of their corrective actions, and that may or may not be something that then we go back and test as part of the next audit. So we're building up to what you and I are probably very familiar of seeing on the state level, where you go back and you do a review again. So the follow-up process is something that our office will continue to follow and see. How it's implemented is obviously a management decision.
Well, I appreciate that. I have a follow-up to that because you led me into my next question, which is what role, from your office's perspective, is the Office of Internal Audit related to the follow-through of the recommendations, to work with the departments, to help the departments, to ensure the departments are actually, completing their corrective actions?
Internal audit is housed within the Office of the County Executive, and they determine how that office will work. I know that the internal audit manager works with departments to help them devise corrective actions and talks through their proposals with them. And that is the role that has been established. I'm sure Mr. Broglie is here and he can tell you much better exactly the steps that he takes and how that process is working from their perspective and their side of things. From our side of things, we do want to be more involved in follow-up so that we have more information about the actions that are taken, and we can continue to monitor and ensure, because part of what the audit process requires is transparency. So it can't be that follow-up is done in the back room and no one knows that the follow-up was done. And so we have an obligation under the Yellow Book standards for us to also report out on follow-up. And so that is the next step as this office continues to evolve, as I am building out our audit program and our responsibilities since 1119 was passed.
Appreciate that. I'm glad you're doing that, and thank you for that response. From the department, what's your view of how you're going to make sure that you demonstrate that the corrective action is taken? Who's assigned to do this, and what, if any, interaction is there with the Office of Internal Audit to work through the corrective actions? Because, I mean, the challenge that I see here is, you're the Inspector General, you're independent. So yes, you absolutely need to do that role for the follow-up, but you're not going to be in the troubleshooting relationship where, before I turn in my assignment, I need somebody to talk to explain, to say, here's what I've done. Do you think this satisfies the corrective action meeting auditing standards, meeting, general accounting practices? I would presume that most of the people who are actually doing the corrective action are not auditors, are not accountants. They, work in some part of the department, and the question is, whose job is that? And I would love to hear from the department of what your expectation is. I think there's a more macro level question and conversation here that I've spoken with the chair about for the GEO committee to potentially look into and take up, because I do think that is a question that we really need to be asking ourselves of how that process works, because this is a perfect example. This was a positive outcome where we went in, we looked at the department from the Inspector General, found some gaps and some holes, nothing malicious, but problems that need to be fixed, and a commitment from the department, which I very much appreciate, to fix them, and a response from the CAO not to deny them, but to commit to improving them. But then the question is, how are we going to provide the support to the team to actually make it happen? And that's where I'm a bit unclear at this point.
Thanks for the question, council member. So as the Inspector General said, every 90 days there's an update on the progress of these corrective actions. And so we continue to work with the Inspector General to make sure those updates are provided regularly so that there's accountability for all of the outstanding actions. I walked through the ones this morning, which we're still working on, which we will continue to work with the IG's office to provide those regular updates, and are committed to making sure that those updates are provided not only in process, but that there's substantive progress to show within each of those.
Appreciate that. So I hope that we can do a more macro level follow-up, because I think this is one example of many, and as we move forward, we're going to have more and more of what is that process, what is that expectation, who is going to be responsible for it, so that we know, and also so that your team knows that, who is the person they're supposed to be turning to, because, frankly, from my perspective, the every 90-day check, to the IG is not the collaborative, troubleshooting dynamic and relationship just because of the independent nature of the office. It has been a good relationship. I think it's working as it's supposed to, but I think we have to keep those lines separate for obvious reasons based on the Inspector General's professional standards. And so we need to have a process where we're providing support to team members who are trying to improve processes but may not have the professional competency and accounting standards and practices, in accounting, in auditing, et cetera, to be able to move forward. So I appreciate that. Thank you for the responses. I'll yield back to you.
Thank you. I just had a couple of questions, and actually one of them was exactly where Council Vice President Friedson was going, because I think there's looking at the corrective actions and how to address those things that were raised, and then it's putting in place the systems to make sure that we are adhering to those practices. And so having both of those move forward at the same time, I think is important, because as Ms. Lamarzi said, you can have those 90-day check-ins, but then it's probably another 4 or 5 years before her office can come around again. And what we really don't want to happen, and it's not to say anyone would do it with intention, but is to see a lapse in some of these things. And so I think it's both fixing and then making sure we have the processes in place so that we're ensuring that we're following these practices. The other thing, and Director Martin, I'm not sure you addressed this, but if you could just talk about some of the other licensing processes and the decal issues that the IG's report also raised, and how the office is addressing those.
Sure.
And these were like the last 3 on the findings.
Thank you for the question, Councilmember. So with respect to the recommendation that DEP update the hauler collector licensing information system, recommendation 4A, in order that it captures the name of the user who performed that activity, as noted in the CAO's response to the Inspector General's report, at the time of the audit, the hauler collector licensing information system was still under development. Subsequent to the time of the audit, the departments updated the system to capture all activity events, including the name of the user who's made changes in the database, any changes made by that user, and the date and time the change was made.
What about the other ones regarding, I think as Ms. Lamarzi talked about, the procedures regarding making sure the decals were secure, and I know some of these are in the packet, but want to make sure folks who are watching this know what is being done to address those concerns.
Certainly. So with respect to recommendation 6A, which was the recommendation that DEP maintain an inventory listing of issued and unissued decals and conduct recurring reconciliation to ensure proper accountability, the department began tracking decals as of November 2022. A spreadsheet's been created to track details by number and month. The decals are recorded as they're issued, and the spreadsheet will provide the number of decals assigned to haulers and collectors, the decal number assigned to a license, and the month it was assigned.
Great. Thank you. I appreciate that. I know that was in our packet, but I think as folks are reviewing this and listening, those were also important to get in the record. I don't see any other questions on this one. I think we'll go to the next report.
Thank you. The second report that the committee has asked to discuss is the county's review of the county's carry-out bag tax program. I told you when I started about our process when we do an audit. So when we got to DEP, it's actually very apropos that these two are together today. As we are doing our research, we are learning about the department. One of the programs we came across was the carry-out bag tax program. At the time that we were initiating our audit, finance really was, under county law, responsible for administering most of the program. And it made sense for us, considering the other areas we wanted to go into in the audit, to strip this out and make it a separate standalone project. So we specifically went in to review the effectiveness of this program itself and the implementation of how it is working. For background, for those who don't know, the bag tax took effect in January of 2012. And it was created to shift the cost of litter cleanup from taxpayers, because the increases to the water quality protection charge and programming was part of our tax bill. It was part of the appropriation process. So to shift part of those costs from the taxpayers to the actual consumers, those of us who go to the store and may need a bag. And also it had a second component too, that they really did want to help the environment, and could we reduce the use of bags in the county and those bags littering our communities and our waterways. Under the law, there is a 5-cent charge for anyone who doesn't know. If you need a bag, plastic or paper, in the county, and a retailer gives you a bag, 4 cents of that is supposed to come back to the county, and the retailer gets to keep 1 cent for their costs. There is a bag tax registration and payment system, and through that, businesses register and say, yes, I am a retailer that gives out bags. They go into that to report the number of bags that they gave out in a set period of time, and a calculation is done by the system for how much then the tax needs to be remitted to the county. The objectives of our review were to evaluate the efforts the county has made to identify all retailers who are required to collect the tax, the carry-out bag tax, and ensure that those retailers that were identified have actually remitted the tax. Our scope was fiscal year of 2020 through fiscal year of 2022. We talked briefly a second ago and mentioned about follow-up audits. The bag tax program had actually been audited by the Office of Internal Audit back in 2014. And Internal Audit at the time had made a number of recommendations. Some of the most important, though, were recommending the creation of a master list of all retailers who would be subject to the tax, likely retailers that would be giving out bags. And they, in that report, made recommendations of different ways the county could consider creating that master list. But no list was actually ever created. And the county continued to rely on that self-registration and self-reporting alone. We went in to take a look and see what was happening. As of fiscal year 2022, there were 1,951 retailers in the system. $2.9 million had been collected in tax from 600 retailers out of that 1951. So our first finding was that the county had not established a method to identify all retailers that should be remitting the tax, and that resulted in potentially missed revenue and decreased the efficiency of the program as a whole. In 2018, DEP did make efforts to try to figure out how they could get involved more and come up with a list of retailers. And their method was to use DLLR data from the state, the Department of Labor Licensing and Regulation. They got up to a number of about 1,550 retailers. So as we were doing our work, we tried to duplicate that. We were very conservative in trying to determine whether a retailer was likely to be the type under DLR's codes that may give out a bag. And using DLR data, we came to a number of about 2,100 retailers, still above the 1951 that was in the county system at the time. In continuing our work, we looked to other jurisdictions in Maryland. Obviously, Montgomery County was a leader in this effort, first out of the gate, but other counties now have started their own programs. Howard County is one that has done a lot and has a very streamlined program. They actually use traders license data which is registered in the circuit court. And Montgomery County's trader's license data is actually a little better because restaurants are required to do that also here. So by using the circuit court data in 2023, our office was able to identify 3,800. So the list continued to grow, and so our finding really is that there wasn't an established method of identifying it, though there are a number of methods available, and I'm sure DEP is going to tell you that they've even tried 3 other methods and come up with even higher numbers recently. But it is a moment where there has been this lost revenue. We did not have a full idea of who should be remitting. And if you don't know who, you don't know how then to enforce it. The second finding was that there are a number of data limitations in the system that is used to track the bag tax, which makes enforcement very challenging. For example, an owner who owns numerous locations of a business may have them all under one account. So there's no way to really be able to track whether they are remitting for every location or just, I am Megan and I own 4 Dunkin' Donuts, and you don't know which ones of my 4 I'm actually sending you my remittance on. The system itself just made that challenging. Similarly, the law actually requires support to be uploaded by the retailers, but the system wouldn't allow that. So there are several enforcement issues. If you don't know and have a complete accounting of all the information, you're not able to then purge out people who may no longer be in business. And then, of course, you have trouble when it comes to enforcing it, and there are penalty options under the county law as well. The third finding was that the $100 remittance threshold makes enforcement assessment difficult. Built into the program, until you have a cumulative of $100 in remittance and tax that you've collected as a retailer, you're not required to submit the money. So we're not expecting retailers to send us $10 this month and 15. It says it's 100, but it's very confusing when that 100 starts or finishes. And it's also very challenging as an administrator. I see a business hasn't remitted for 3 or 4 months. Are they simply not remitting, or have they not met the $100 threshold? And so that makes it challenging for consistency. It makes it challenging for being able to operationalize it in a way that is most efficient. And so that was our third finding. Our fourth was that retailers simply are not complying with the bag tax requirements. And to do this, we went out into the field and did some testing. The first group of tests that we did, we chose 7 retailers that had paid the tax in FY20 and had stopped paying in 21 and 22 and were still in business. 5 of those 7 charged us for the bag, 2 did not. And so the question becomes, what happened to that tax that they charged us? It was collected, but it wasn't remitted. Or it may not have yet been remitted. Perhaps they weren't up to their $100. We couldn't say that for certain. That's why you see not very specifics in the report, but that is where it leads you, and I think logically leads you, especially if we're talking about retailers that hadn't remitted for 2 years already. And that is lost revenue, and it also is an inequity that some retailers are following the program, some folks aren't, and there's no one holding anyone accountable to that. The second group of retailers we tested that showed that there was non-compliance with the program, where we chose 7 retailers in the county, again, that were likely, had the type of business likely to give bags, and they were not registered with the county. 6 of them gave us bags with no charge at all. 1, the receipt didn't have an itemization, so we couldn't tell. So there's definitely a broad spectrum of how folks are complying with this law. And lastly, our finding was that the county should do more to assess the impact of the tax. Currently, there is not data gathered to assess consumer behavior on a routine basis, whether it's reduced or not because of the bill. Whether litter is reduced or not, it's challenging. We live in a very metropolitan area. We're connected to a lot of different jurisdictions, but there isn't consistent data to see if the bill and the law and the tax itself is having the desired effect that the county hoped for. Without that data, you don't know what changes need to be made to the system. You don't know what changes may need to be made to the legislation. You don't know if the tax is something we should continue or not if you're not tracking and have any metrics to know whether it is effective in some manner in meeting the goals and having the results that were hoped for. The findings resulted in 5 recommendations to the county to identify first all retailers who are required to comply and remit carry-out bag tax, and to proactively ensure that they are informed about this program and about their need to remit the appropriate tax. Our second recommendation is to require retailers to identify by name and address each location they file for, and to enforce the requirement that they provide that backup and information of all the transactions that are subject to the tax. Third is to pursue legislative changes to remove the $100 remittance threshold that we identified as a challenge to the enforcement, and modify any other requirements that may be needed. Fourth is to actively enforce the law and pursue fines for those who are non-compliant. And lastly, to find a way and to routinely assess the impact of the law on consumer behavior and litter in the waterways, which was the intended purpose of this law and the tax itself. And again, I do want to thank my staff who worked on this project. Everyone, a lot of folks did have to go out and shop for us to do our testing, but it was led by Stephanie Leahy Ali and Eric Eskew as well. So thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Ms. Malarzi. Director Munger, if you'd like to provide us information. I know this is a big one. I mean, the other one was important and it will take a lot of work, but this goes back a number of years, and so we'd like to hear about where the department is and where you'd like to take this.
Thank you, Chair Stewart. There's a lot to unpack from this bag, and under different circumstances, the division chief responsible for enforcement and administration of this program in DEP would be here providing the updates of what actions have been taken and what results have been achieved. Unfortunately, they are unavailable due to a family commitment this week, so I am your substitute bagger, and happy to provide you updates on progress and describe what's being done. So by way of background, since the inception of the law, while the Department of Protection and Department of Finance had joint responsibilities on the administration of the bag tax, DEP was formally delegated the authority for enforcement of the bag tax on October 27th of 2022. In April of this past year, we filled a position that's specifically focused on enforcement of this tax, and there's been some good results and progress so far that I'll fill you in on in my notes and testimony here momentarily. Based on what I've seen to date, this position and the department's focused on increased oversight and enforcement will better enable us to monitor and promote compliance with the law's requirement. And before addressing the specific recommendations in the inspector's June 2023 report, I want to provide some of the background and highlights of what's happened so far. So one of the challenges that the Inspector General's report identified was that there's currently no authoritative inventory or database of all of the businesses in Montgomery County that are subject to the bag tax law. As I mentioned, we hired in April of this year a staff person devoted to administration and enforcement of the law. They've been very busy. Our primary focus on efforts since April have been creating that baseline inventory so that we can use it to ensure compliance with the law's requirements going forward. Through a combination of direct mailers to businesses and direct outreach, we now have identified approximately 5,400 storefronts that are subject to pay the bag tax based on the nature of their business. These storefronts have been mapped and will serve as the base as DEP. They've been mapped and will serve as DEP's enforcement field audit base for audits moving forward. In addition, we're looking at making modifications to the bag tax system so that we can have a more detailed tracking of storefronts. As the Inspector General referenced, the current system is set up for a reporter of multiple locations to consolidate their remittance into one business. So think of a giant supermarket chain, for example, with multiple locations across the county. To consolidate their remittance into one business versus having it reported at the individual storefront location level. So having the ability to track which store location is remitted. I actually liked your Dunkin' Donuts example. I think we'd have a different relationship if you owned 5 different Dunkin' Donuts. So having the ability to track which store location remitted payment will help with outreach and enforcement efforts, and so that'll be a helpful function. A second major component of our efforts has been focused on businesses understand their responsibilities under the law for reporting, collecting, and remitting the bag tax. So we've translated the bag tax website and outreach materials into Amharic, Chinese, French, Japanese, Korean, and Vietnamese. These efforts have contributed to an increase of reporters by about 160 businesses, bringing an additional $17,000 in bag tax revenues. In addition, visits were made to more than 80 businesses that have not remitted payment, and those enforcement efforts to date have resulted in the collection of over $100,000 in bag taxes for the county. And so one of the challenges identified in the Inspector General's report is, as the Inspector General herself noted, is how to assess the impact of the bag tax law, specifically the impact of the law on consumer behavior and on litter in area waterways. The department monitors trash in the county's waterways as part of our municipal separate storm sewer system, or MS4, permit requirements. And as the Inspector General alluded to, it's difficult to measure the impact of a single law on consumer behavior. And we have people that work in a different jurisdiction that might stop at a store on the way home and bring a bag into the county from elsewhere that could end up being littered in our streams. And of course, consumer behavior is a very broad and important topic that has a lot of measurement considerations moving forward. So while we don't have an effective way yet of measuring the impact of the bag tax in those respects, we're absolutely continuing to explore the assessment of options while also continuing to build out the systems we have in place to make sure we're enforcing these requirements. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for that update and all the work that has been put in place since since April. I had a couple of questions, just a follow up. As you were talking about the efforts you've been making, do you know, or do we have any estimate of the loss of revenue that we've had over the years because of the fact that we did not have, I won't say complete because I'm not sure we'll ever have a complete list, but we did not have a sufficient list to be tracking this, and that we weren't going out and doing enforcement or the education needed.
Council member, thank you for the question. I don't have that number handy, but happy to get back to you with more information.
Great. Ms. Marzi, did you have something?
We made efforts, knowing that would be a big question that people would have. So we tried to come up with different ways. We used, for an example, we used our the 2100 retailer number that we first developed using DLLR data. And we said if all of those retailers did a minimum of $100 in the year, which is being exceptionally conservative. Think of the large supermarkets, right? So exceptionally conservative, that we would get to about $210,000 that should have been remitted. If you take the average of remittance from FY 18 to 22, that was $3,941 per retailer, times that to the 2,100 retailers, you come closer to $8 million over those fiscal years. So there's no real way to know exactly how much revenue has been lost. We're just trying to give you some different ideas. I know recently DEP has had new retailers come forward, and they've reported and made filings of in 1 month 55,000 plus, almost 56,000 bags in a month from just 29 filers. So it is a large number we are talking about. Not to be lost, of course, I mean, the county did collect over $2 million in 20, no, it had to be more recent than that. I apologize. In fiscal year 22, the tax remitted to the county was $2.9 million. We're not
Getting
receiving the money, obviously. But you know, in FY18 it was $2,572,000, and in 22 we're at 2.9. So it's growing, but it's definitely, that's based on low numbers. Again, only 600 people, retailers remitted in FY22.
Right. Great. And Ms. Lamarzi brought up the issue of equity, you know, that some people are doing it and other businesses aren't. As you've been, now that you have a database of 5,400 storefronts and been doing that outreach, do you know, is it more smaller, larger retail establishments that have failed to remit in the past?
Thanks for the question, council member. I'm going to turn to my colleague to see if they know the answer to that question, and if they don't, happy to get back with you.
Sure.
Vicky Wan here. Good morning. I think it varies between large and small. You have some supermarkets that have some cashiers that maybe don't know or forget. You have some smaller businesses that find it challenging. Some people come in and they challenge the, you know, why do I have to pay this 5-cent tax? So it varies.
Great. Thank you, Ms. Vaughn. And as you've been going through this process and going through the IG's reports and recommendations, have other things come up for all of you that would improve this program? And understanding that the person who's been doing this is unfortunately not with us today.
Yeah, so I will say that by having a dedicated resource working on this, we've seen really objective improvements in a short amount of time. So, you know, I think that as we think about resources moving forward, I'm reminded of the axiom that you know, what gets measured gets done, but you also need someone doing the measurements and doing the work as part of a dedicated portfolio. So I'm grateful for the terrific staff resource we have working on this, and I think as we continue to build out the program, we'll continue to realize more benefits and efficiencies that can come out of it. I know for us, having somebody working on it has made at the risk of stating the obvious, a very measurable and important difference since this task was officially delegated to DEP.
Great. Thank you. Councilmember Katz.
Thank you very much. Do the plastic mailers that you get from sometimes Amazon, sometimes they send you a box, but they put it in like a big plastic bag as a mailer. L.L. Bean does that a lot. I would assume that they're not paying their fair share. And there's considerable, I mean, we talk about equity, there's considerable purchases of those types of businesses. So I think when we talk about this, I think we have to realize that from when this bag tax went into effect, and I had a business at that point, I can tell you it certainly caused a lot of excitement, but from when this bag tax went into effect to today, retail has changed dramatically. You know, and it's very tough for, I had a regular store, but most of my business was shoes, a lot of it, and the company itself, not that I did it, but the company itself realized that nationwide that they made a shoebox that you turn into a handle so that they could carry out, you know, so the consumer who just paid you $100 for the shoes didn't have to pay you a nickel for a bag. And people really did reject that. And in the beginning, you had people who would bring in their own bags. I think the pandemic changed some of that, but in the beginning you did. And there was a time in life that if somebody brought in an empty bag into your store, thought they might be a shoplifter. I mean, it changed the mindset of what was happening. But it would be very tough for anyone that's doing this, and I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't do it, but it would be very tough for someone to estimate how many bags that store in Giant. You stand in line in Giant. There are people that bring in their carry-on bags. There are people who don't. There are people that'll take a couple items. Now, if you do your own checkout and carry it out that way, just put it in the cart. So I don't know how you could figure out how you're going to do it. I mean, obviously somebody has to figure it out. And then, for instance, you talk about Dunkin' Donuts, and that's an interesting one. As I was coming down the hall, I will not mention the council president by name, but when I was coming down the hall today, the council president, someone in his staff, had some boxes from Dunkin' Donuts, but they didn't have, I'm starting.
Happy birthday, David.
Yeah, okay. But they didn't have it in a bag, is my point. That, even those types of businesses that would, you figure that they would be having a lot of bags. If you buy a dozen donuts, it's not in a bag. So I don't know how you're going to estimate all this. This is not an easy one. It really is not. And so I'm gonna leave it. The other thing is, for the whole idea for the $100 threshold, so I know that finance doesn't want to fool with $8 a month. I mean, you'd have to say that, whether it's, if you don't reach the $100 threshold every 6 months, every whatever, you need to send a remittance. But when you buy these bags, it's you buy them by the thousands. In some cases, the $100 that you ultimately will be paying for that is about the cost of that bag, for those 1,000 bags. So we have to, if you thought about that, you would pay for it when you bought it at wholesale, that then you'd guarantee that you get but you're doubling the price of the bag for the consumer, to the retailer, who it sounds like it's a big deal. They get a penny out of it. They had to get a cash register with another key. I had to get a cash register with an extra key so that I could ring up the bags. This is not it's for a good reason, but it's not an easy thing to accomplish. And with that, I'll leave. Thank you.
Thank you, Council President Glass, and I'll go to Council Vice President Friedson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So the donuts, since we're picking up on that theme, were for one of my staff members, my Deputy Chief of Staff, David. So happy birthday, David. But clearly, my office, we try not to use plastic bags at all, right? And I try not to in my car, and my coat closet are just full of cloth bags or other types of bags for whatever needs we have. But trying to drill down a bit more into this IG report, into the questions it raises, because it just raises a lot more questions. Ms. Lamarza, you were talking about kind of your spot check, right? And going to different businesses, and some, I don't remember exactly the number, 3 charging, 1 not. Can you share with us the types of businesses, clearly without mentioning names, but just to get an understanding, because as the chair and Councilmember Katz have noted, there is an equity issue here. And so can you kind of paint a picture as to what you saw firsthand in the different types of businesses?
Sure. I don't know right off the top of my head the exact businesses we went to. I do know the criteria we set in choosing them. We went all around the county. I did not choose only locations in certain areas of the county, recognizing that there is a different effect in different communities. Okay, I do know that there were a variety of different types of retailers, places like a gas station that has a store, an actual retail establishment that sells goods, not just food, kind of a thing. So we did go for variety in location and type of establishment that we chose. I can look at the data and tell you more specifics if you would like, but that was a consideration in determining where we went. Most importantly, we wanted to start with businesses that in 1 year had remitted, so they knew about the tax, because there is a question, of course, always of education. But for the next 2 years did not, but we knew they were still in business. And so that was very important to also establish as we were just determining where we were going to go and do the spot checks.
Sure. And you understand the question I'm asking, so I'll leave it to you to follow back up
I
with
will do
us
that.
as to whether or not there was a change in management, someone just didn't know, whether someone decided to get greedy and just not remit, right? So lots of different questions, and just want to make sure that just asking to see if it paints a broader picture in the community. But that belies the bigger problem that you and DEP have identified, and that we have discussed here, particularly at the Economic Development Committee of the council, of that we do not have one list of businesses here in the county. That you mentioned the trader's license fees, which is an interesting way to do it, and then the ever increasing number of applicable businesses, and I think the highest number from DEP was 5,400, somewhere around there. You know, when we're talking about providing grants for businesses along the Purple Line route, we don't even have a list of businesses, right? And so would love to learn the 5,400 businesses, where you've gotten that from. I would love to share that with other agencies and departments within the county government, so that maybe we can come to have one list, quite frankly. But so that put a pin on that, because that is a bigger issue here in Montgomery County. And then, much like with the previous topic about the sub-districts, and is that something that we want to continue? Clearly, you're raising another big picture question of what is the utility of this program? And I'm not sure if I saw it in the report, but because it is germane for this conversation, I'm going to ask DEP, how have the revenues from this been over the last number of years, and what is your assessment of consumer attitudes here in Montgomery County with regard to the bag fee and utilization of plastic bags?
Thanks, Council Member. So the Inspector General referenced this on page 2 of their report. The bag tax collected for FYs 2018 to 2022 are listed, and as the Inspector General noted, we've gone from 2,572,000 in FY 2018 to just under 3 million in FY 2022. So there is absolutely an associated revenue stream. You know, I think you raise a good question about prevailing attitudes on this topic, and you know, Montgomery County, to its credit, adopted this law a long time ago, before many other jurisdictions, and there's you know, it's hard to characterize consumer attitudes in a monolithic way. There's a lot of relevant considerations, but I think when we think about the rationale for adopting the law originally, and also the fact, as Councilmember Katz noted, that retail, of course, has evolved. In some ways, a lot of different streams of packaging have been developed in the last 12 years. There's a lot of it. The PBS NewsHour did a documentary recently called "The Plastics Problem," which noted a headline that many of you may have seen. A plastic bag was actually found at the bottom of the Mariana Trench of the Pacific Ocean. So, you know, I think, I guess to answer your question, Councilmember Glass, I'm applauding the rationale from an environmental perspective for policies like this one that account for ways we can drive consumer behavior that will result in less waste.
Right, because looking at the chart that is included in the IG report, from FY18, FY22, there's been a 10 million additional bags, and that's just what we've counted, right, based on the tax revenue. And so now we know that that number is higher, because there are some that aren't even remitting that. There have been articles written over the last number of years with regard to our the fees that we've collected, saying clearly this shows that the policy is a failure, has been a conclusion some have come to. I actually differ from that idea and say that 5 cents is clearly not a deterrent. And if the goal is to deter plastic bag usage, there are 2 avenues to go down. One is to ban plastic bags entirely, as other jurisdictions have done, or recognize that 5 cents is not a deterrent and increase the fee to change consumer behavior. Those are conversations I want to continue at the Transportation and Environment Committee, and I also appreciate the equity issue, as I noted that Councilmember Katz mentioned. I will say, I'm talking about my own consumer behavior. I try not to order things online for a variety of reasons, because I like shopping local. I like having stores that are occupied, and know that whenever you order something online, it hurts our local economy. But you are absolutely right that as we continue, as society continues moving in that direction, whenever there is a plastic bag wrapping a cardboard box, wrapping another plastic bag, there are other things that we should be looking at as well. So thank you for bringing that, and we'll talk about that at the T&E committee as well. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Council Vice President Friedson.
Thank you. Thanks for the report. I think this is important. It's an important topic. Obviously, I will note, as somebody who used to work at a tax collection agency, taxes are done for 2 reasons. One is to generate revenue, and the other is to change behavior. And I fundamentally don't believe that this tax is intended to generate revenue. That's not its primary purpose. It's not to say that we shouldn't be collecting the revenue that is being charged and doing it the way that it is intended. I just think that is not the public policy goal here. I don't believe that was the public policy goal over a decade ago when it was put in place. And I still don't believe it is the public policy goal. And I will note that there have been a lot of studies throughout the country on bag taxes, and the evidence is that they overwhelmingly do work, that they overwhelmingly do change people's behavior. Do they change everybody's behavior all the time? No, but do they effectively, dramatically change on a large scale how a lot of people think and act? Yes. The answer is yes. Unequivocally yes. And you can go to any grocery store, you can go to any place in the county, and you will see people bringing disposable bags, including me. I have a bag of bags, like I think many people do, and I have one large bag, and within the one large bag, I have dozens of reusable bags, and I, use them as when I go shopping, and when I go to the farmer's market, I stick one. I take one of the the less cloth types, and I put it in my back pocket or stick it in my jacket pocket. So I think it's important when we talk about this that we understand what the actual public policy goal is. I appreciate the recommendation, but I also understand the response related to assessing the effectiveness on the policy side of it. I do agree it is hard because of, how do you check into the Chesapeake Bay watershed, what is a Montgomery County bag versus, another jurisdiction's bag. I think that's hard to determine. We know what's there, but we don't know necessarily exactly from where it came. And so, I do think that's an area of, sitting next to my COG chair colleague, who's also my committee chair colleague, I think that would be something the Council of Governments could really help lead on, and we could work with other jurisdictions, because I think the question really is, how is the region doing on this? Because, our watershed is not our watershed. It is the region's watershed. And so really the question is, from a regional perspective, are we doing our part, and are our regional partners doing their part to bring down the number of plastic bags that have devastating effects on the watershed and on the broader environmental climate writ large. So I wanted to note that I think that's important. I'll note on the online piece, as someone who worked on the remote sales for out of state, which was a major issue and took a very long time to do. We don't have the authority to deal with online, as everybody here knows, but it does raise a concern and a challenge in an area of working with the state and the federal government to address those issues, because they are important issues, and they do put our local businesses at an unfair disadvantage. The challenge at the state level with remote sales was actually the online retailers. People did owe the tax; they just didn't pay it. They owed the use tax, not the sales tax. The other side of it that nobody thinks about. But I think the total amount of money collected on the use tax from online sales, when we looked into it, it was like 7 people, all of whom I think were lawyers, who were afraid of not, specifically following the law, and it was, in the couple $1,000 range. Remote sales represent, tens of millions of dollars a year. Amazon alone, their tax to the state is over $50 million a year. Just one, one very large business, but just one business, just to give a sense. So a few questions on this. We talked about the enforcement side of this. What's the penalty? You find somebody who is not in compliance. What's the penalty? Which is in here. I just want you to state it. And is that charged on the first time? Is there, a number of times for you to demonstrate that you haven't done it before that gets charged? How's that handled?
Thank you for the question, Councilmember. I'm going to turn to my colleague Vicky Wan to answer.
We try not to penalize, but to educate first. So right now, we're very focused on education and outreach, and to ensure that all of the businesses and all of the cashiers that they hire know that this law exists, and to provide that educational material. But in accordance with the law, the penalty is, hang on a second.
I think $750. Right?
It's a Class A violation, which
Which is
I think is,
$500 for the first violation.
yeah,
And then $750 for the second. Yeah.
right.
Okay. Have you ever charged a violation?
We have not.
Okay. What list of businesses are you using? Like when you're finding out somebody's not in compliance, is it based on a complaint? Consumer comes in, isn't charged the bag tax, knows to call DEP, knows your number, calls 311, or is it
Well, right now, we have several efforts to look for additional businesses. So one, we've mapped the 5,400 based on various data sets that we've compiled. We've mapped them, and we're happy to share with Councilmember Glass after this so that you know where they are actually geographically. That's very important to us. Second, how we enforce right now is looking at who has paid prior and who hasn't paid for the past.
So it's people who
couple
are
of
paying
years.
who stopped paying.
That's right. That's right.
So if someone has never paid,
Right.
they're not going to be on your radar.
So as the director mentioned, we went to 80 businesses and we collected about $100,000 from those 80 businesses.
Right.
And so some of the feedback that we heard from them was, oh, I'm sorry, we just forgot that we had to do this. And there were some staffing changes within those businesses that just didn't know that they had to remit this payment.
Got it. Okay. And then the list of businesses, I think, is an important point. So you created this list yourself? Like this is a DEP list that you aggregated from different sources?
Correct.
Okay. I just will note the broader issue here. In all kinds of different scenarios, we need lists of businesses. And the idea that individual departments have to put together their own list is part of the problem. That's not a DEP problem. It's a county government problem. We saw this during COVID. We've talked about it on the economic development side. We need to have a much better effort of figuring out exactly what businesses there are, what class of businesses they are, what services they need, what taxes they should be paying. I mean, on both sides of it, we need to do a better job of that. Again, it's not a DEP issue, but I will continue to push for that because it is a huge hole in our ability to serve and work with businesses, and it's really unfair, on the equity side of a business who's doing what they're supposed to be doing versus a business that isn't. Part of that comes to the people that we're reaching, the education side of it. This is a county government that likes to regulate a lot of things, and we have to be able to communicate with businesses on what we're expecting of them. And if we don't know who they are, we can't communicate with them. And so I think that is a major problem. Other question, there was a change prior to this report, from what I can tell, from DEP and finance duly handling this to just DEP. What prompted that change?
Council member, that happened before I was on the clock here, so I don't actually have an answer for you sitting here right now, but happy to get you more information on the background behind that change.
Yeah, I'd appreciate it because I think it's an interesting dynamic. I mean, if that had changed as a result of this report, I could understand. We think we could do it better if we just had one department, being the point person. But it would be interesting to understand why we made that change. What was the impetus behind it, and to assess and determine how it's working. Okay, well, I appreciate it. Like I said, bag taxes work. I mean, I'm not if this was just a revenue grab from local businesses, I probably would not be supportive of it. But there is a much bigger policy goal here of what, is trying to be accomplished. And I think the evidence overwhelmingly demonstrates that it works. It can't be the only tool to, reduce plastics and to reduce, environmentally, detrimental, items that are unnecessary and potentially superfluous in the community. But it does reduce them significantly and makes an impact. So I don't want to lose sight of that. Yes, there are improvements that could be made, but no, the intention of this is not just to generate revenue. Yes, overwhelmingly, the evidence suggests that this works, although I think it would be helpful, as noted, to work with regional partners and maybe with the COG leadership to think through how we can access this on a regional basis, because that's really what this is about, is how do we come up with a regional approach to improve the environmental quality and the quality of our watershed. So I'll yield back.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Vice President Friedson. Thank you for this information. As Council President Glass said, this will still be taken up as we look at the Transportation and Environment Committee, because I think there's a lot more digging into. Questions raised by Councilmember Katz. The technology is always advancing, right? I have my bag of bags as well, and it's interesting when you do go to stores, some small and some large, the way they've automated things so that they're asking you, how many bags did you bring to the store? Are you using the store bags? And so I'm very glad that you now have the resources within DEP and somebody dedicated to working on this, so that they can collect those experiences and figure out how we can best make sure this bag tax is working for our community. And so I look forward to continued conversations on that. And before, Ms. Lamarzi, we let you go today, I did want to come back to your overview. And I think you said you had a 94% increase in activity. That's a lot that you're seeing. And I don't know at this time if it's appropriate, or I think if you can expand at that at all. Just thinking about, the council has talked about making sure that we're thinking about different departments and their resources well before we get to the budget process. And when I see that your hotline activity is up 94%, even though we did increase the resources for your department last year, just wanted to know if there are any other insights you have on that.
I don't think any of you will be surprised to know the vast majority is related to MCPS.
Okay.
And I think that,
should come a little closer.
I'm sorry, I think that is a contributing factor, that the MCPS community knows that we are here and that we can listen and help, and if not address their concerns ourselves, we can get them to the right people. We made a big push to make sure our information was in all of the schools and throughout central office. And I think also in county government, the more that we have gone out and we are doing proactive audits and reviews, and I hope the stories go back that it really is everyone working to the common goal of, let's make this better. How can we improve? How can we find ways and take the time to adjust? But certainly 94% increase this quarter over last year at the same time is driven in large part by the school system, and the county council did appropriate positions last year, and I think I will be requesting more positions so that we can make sure we address those needs as timely as possible.
Great. Well, thank you for that update. Thank you, everyone. As was noted before, this is the second time that the Audit Committee has kind of come together to do a deep dive on the IG reports. Last time we also had the internal auditor come and talk about some things. We will continue this practice because I think it's very beneficial to bring light and hear how we're doing on these reports. And so I thank you. I thank you for the collaboration in particular, and looking forward to how we're making our county government work best for our community. So thank you. And with that, we are done. Thanks.